Well, hello there, and welcome to the Cory Doctorow podcast. Greetings from, I kid you not, my parents' basement here in frigid Toronto, Canada. I am literally sitting in my parents' basement in my pajamas here at about 8:30 in the morning, um, having just done my day's work on the novel and answered the email and done the blogging. And why, you may ask, am I sitting here in frigid Toronto? And I kid you not, it is really cold. In no part thanks to me. It turns out last night when I tried to shut off the lights in the basement, I actually turned off the furnace. So when we woke up this morning, there was like icicles on our toes. Um, why am I in Toronto? I am in Toronto because this was the weekend of Confusion in Troy, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. This was a con that I was the guest of honor at, which was completely, absolutely made of awesome sauce. Um, I just had a tremendous time, and what was really remarkable were the number of people who came up to me and said, "I really liked Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town. That's such a good book." And I said, "Well, I'm podcasting it." And they said, "Well, I had no idea." So to all of you who are at Confusion this weekend, greetings. It was a great trip. I flew to Toronto, saw the family Thursday night, got on the plane got in the car on Friday morning, my parents' car, and drove down. Apart from being detained for an hour at the border at Sarnia, it was a fantastic trip, and thankfully the Canadian border was a little nicer coming back. Um, those of you who are in Toronto, or who are passing through, or who want to mail order some signed books, I have dropped in at Baca Phoenix Books and signed all their stock, so they do have a bunch of signed books, and they do mail order. So get yours while they're still hot, unlike everything else here. I'm getting on a plane tonight, flying back to London, and then on Friday, my parents, my brother and sister-in-law, and their baby, and my wife, and our daughter Posey, we are all getting on the Eurostar, and we're taking the train to Disneyland Paris because it's my daughter's first birthday, something I find remarkable in the extreme. Um, I mentioned earlier For the Win. That's the new novel. It is going smashingly. Just wrote the 13,000th word of it in 13 days. And at that rate, I should be done in just over 2 months, at least with a full draft. Just clipping along at about 1,000 words a day. Um, one last pimpage here. The electronic Hugo ballot is now live. I mention this because I finally filled mine in yesterday and sent it off to the Hugo administrators. So if you attended uh, uh, the Worldcon in Denver, or if you're planning on attending the Worldcon in Montreal and you've already bought your membership, you still have a few days. You can nominate for the Hugo, and among the works that I have eligible for the Hugo is my novel Little Brother, with my YA book that came out last year, as well as for Best Related Book, my essay collection Content, which you've heard much of here on this podcast, and also the short story True Names, which you've heard podcast here, and my graphic novel, Cory Doctorow's Futuristic Tales of the Here and Now, all eligible for Hugo nominations. If you liked any of them, I would hope that you would, and you're eligible, I would hope that you would nominate. If you didn't like any of them and you liked other stuff, I hope you'll nominate that. And without further ado, here we go. Back to Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town, my 2005 novel. Once upon a time, Alan's mother gave birth to 3 sons in 3 months. Birthing sons was hardly extraordinary. Before these three came along, she'd already had 4 others. But the interval, well, that was unusual. As the eldest, Alan was the first to recognize the early signs of her pregnancy. The laundry loads of diapers and play clothes he had fed into her belly unbalanced more often, and her spin cycle became almost lackadaisical, so the garments had to hang out on the line for days before they stiffened and dried completely. Alan liked to sit with his back against his mother's hard enamel side while she rocked and gurgled and churned. It comforted him. The details of her conception were always mysterious to Alan. He'd been walking down into town to attend day school for 5 years, and he'd learned all about the birds and the bees, and he thought that maybe his father, the mountain, impregnated his mother by means of some strange pollen carried on the gusts of winds from his deep and gloomy caves. There was a gnome, too, who made sure that the long hose that led from Alan's mother's back to the spring pool in his father's belly remained clear and unfouled, and sometimes Alan wondered if the gnome dove in for his father's seed and fed it up into his mother's intake. Alan's life was full of mysteries, and he'd long since learned to keep his mouth shut about his home life when he was at school. He attended all three births, along with the smaller kids, Bill and Donald. Charlie, the island, was still small enough to float in the middle of their father's heart pool, waiting on tenterhooks for his mother's painful off-balance spin cycle to spend itself before reverently opening the round glass door and removing the infant within. Edward was fat, even for a baby. He looked like an elongated soccer ball with a smaller ball on top. He cried healthily, though, and gave hearty suck to their mother's exhaust valve once Alan had cleaned the soap suds and fabric softener residue from his little body. His father gusted proud, warm, blustery winds over them and their little domestic scene. Alan noticed that little Edward, for all his girth, was very light, and wondered if the baby was full of helium or some other airy substance. Certainly he hardly appeared to be full of baby, since everything he ate and drank passed through him in a matter of seconds, hardly digested at all. Alan had to go into town twice to buy new 12-pound boxes of clean white shop rags to clean up the slime trail the baby left behind him. Drew, at 3, seemed to take a perverse delight in the scummy water, spreading it around the cave as much as possible. The grove in front of the cave mouth was booby-trapped with clothesline upon clothesline, all hung with diapers and rags drying out in the early spring sunlight. 30 days later, Alan came home from school to find the younger kids surrounding his mother as she rocked from side to side, actually popping free of the grooves her small metal feet had worn in the cave floor over the years. 2 babies in 30 days! Such a thing was unheard of in their father's cave. Edward, normally a sweet-tempered baby, howled long screams that resonated through Alan's milk teeth and made his testicles shrivel up into hard stones. Alan knew his mother liked to be left alone when she was in labor, but he couldn't just stand there and watch her shake and shiver. He went to her and pressed his palms to her top, tried to soothe and restrain her. Bill, the second eldest, and still only 4 years old, followed suit. Edward's screams grew even louder, loud and hoarse and utterly terrified, echoing off their father's walls and back to them. Soon Alan was sobbing too, biting his lip to keep the sounds inside, and so were the other children. Dylan wrinkled his brow and screamed a high-pitched wail that could have cut glass. Alan's mother rocked harder, and her exhaust hose dislodged itself. A high-pressure jet of cold, soapy water spurted from her back parts, painting the cave wall with suds. Edward crawled into this puddle as it formed and scooped small handsful of the liquid into his mouth between howls. And then it stopped. His mother stopped rocking, stopped shaking. The stream trailed off into a trickle. Alan stopped crying, and soon the smaller kids followed suit. Even Edward. The echoes continued for a moment, and then they too stopped. The silence was as startling and nearly as unbearable as the cacophony had been. With a trembling hand, Alan opened his mother's door and extracted little Frederick. The baby was small and cyanotic blue. Alan tipped the baby over and shook him gently, and the baby vomited up such a fantastic quantity of wash-water, a prodigious stream that soaked the front of Alan's school trousers and his worn brown loafers. Finally it ended, and the baby let out a healthy yowl. Alan shifted the infant to one arm and gingerly reconnected the exhaust hose and set the baby down alongside of its end. The baby wouldn't suck, though. Across the cave, from his soggy seat in the puddle of wastewater, Edward watched the new baby with curious eyes. He crawled across the floor and nuzzled his brother with his high forehead. Frederick squirmed and fussed, and Edward shoved him to one side and sucked. His little diaper dripped as the liquid passed directly through him. Alan patiently picked dripping Edward up and put him over one shoulder and gave Frederick the tube to suck. Frederick gummed at the hose's end, then fussed some more, whimpering. Edward squirmed in his arms, nearly plummeting to the hard floor. "Billy," Alan said to the solemn little boy, who nodded, "can you take care of Edward for a little while? I need to clean up." Billy nodded again and held out his pudgy arms. Alan grabbed some clean shop rags and briskly wiped Frederick down, then laid another across Billy's shoulder and set Edward down. The baby promptly set to snoring. Danny started screaming again, with no provocation, and Alan took 2 swift steps to bridge the distance between them and smacked the child hard enough to stun him silent. Alan grabbed a mop and a bucket and sloshed the puddles into the drainage groove where his mother's wastewater usually ran, out the cave mouth and into a stand of choking mountain grass that fed greedily and thrived riotous in the phosphates from the detergent. Frederick did not eat for 30 days, and during that time he grew so thin that he appeared to shrivel like a raisin, going hard and folded in upon himself. Alan spent hours patiently spooning sudsy water into his little pink mouth, but the baby wouldn't swallow, just spat it out and whimpered and fussed. Edward liked to twine around Alan's feet like a cat as he joggled and spooned and fretted over Frederick. It was all Alan could do not to go completely mad, but he held it together, though his grades slipped. His mother vibrated nervously, and his father's winds grew so unruly that two of the golems came around to the cave to make their slow, peevish complaints. Alan shoved a baby into each of their arms and seriously lost his shit upon them, screaming himself hoarse at them while hanging more diapers, more rags, more clothes on the line, tossing his unfinished homework in their faces. But on the 30th day, his mother went into labor again, a labor so frenzied that it dislodged a stalactite and sent it crashing and chundering to the cave floor in a fractious shivering of flinders. Alan took a chip in the neck and it opened up a small cut that nevertheless bled copiously and ruined his favorite t-shirt with Snoopy sitting atop his doghouse and an aviator's helmet, firing an imaginary machine gun at the cursed Red Baron. That was nearly the final straw for Alan, but he held fast and waited for the labor to pass, and finally unlatched the door and extracted little George, a peanut of a child, a lima bean infant, curled and fetal and eerily quiet. He set the little half-baby down by the exhaust hose, where he'd put shriveled Frederick in a hopeless hope that the baby would suck, would ingest, finally. And ingest Frederick did. His dry and desiccated jaw swung open like a snake's, unhinged and spread wide, and he swallowed little George, ate him up in 3 convulsive swallows, the new baby making Frederick's belly swell up like a balloon. Alan swallowed panic, seized Frederick by the heels, and shook him upside down. "Spit him out!" Alan cried. "Spat him free!" But Frederick kept his lips stubbornly together, and Alan tired of the terrible business and set the boy down with the newest brother within, down on a pile of hay he'd brought in to soak up some of Edward's continuous excretions. Alan put his hands over his face and sobbed because he'd failed his responsibilities as eldest of their family, and there was no one he could tell his woes to. The sound of baby giggles stopped his crying. Edward had belly crawled to Frederick's side, and he was eating him, jaw unhinged and gorge working. He was up to Frederick's little bottom, dehydrated to a leathery baby jerky, and then he was past, swallowing the arms and the chins and the head, the giggling, smiling head, the laughing head that had done nothing but whine and fuss since Alan had cleared it of its volume of detergenty water, fresh from their mother's belly. And then Frederick was gone. Horrified, Alan rushed over and picked up Edward, now as heavy as a cannonball, and pried his mouth open, staring down his gullet, staring down into another mouth, Frederick's mouth, which gaped open, revealing a third mouth, George's. The smallest mouth twisted and opened, then shut. Edward squirmed furiously, and Alan nearly fumbled him. He set the baby down in the straw and watched him crawl across to their mother, where he sucked hungrily. Automatically, Alan gathered up an armload of rags and made ready to wipe up the stream that Edward would soon be ejecting. But no stream came. The baby fed and let out a deep burp in 3-part harmony, spat up a little, and drank some more. Somehow Frederick and George were in there feeding too. Alan waited patiently for Edward to finish feeding, then put him over his shoulder and joggled him until he burped up, then bedded him down in his little rough-hewn crib, the crib that the golems had carved for Alan when he was born, cleaned the cave, and cried again, leaned up against their mother. Frederick huddled in on himself, half behind Edward on the porch, habitually phobic of open spaces. Alan took his hands and then embraced him. He smelled of Edward's clammy guts and of sweat. "Are you too hungry?" Alan asked. Edward grimaced. "Of course we're hungry, but without George there's nothing we can do about it, is there?" Alan shook his head. "How long has he been gone?" 3 weeks, Edward whispered. "I'm so hungry, Alan." "How did it happen?" Frederick wobbled on his feet, then leaned heavily on Edward. "I need to sit down," he said. Alan fumbled for his keys and led them into the house, where they settled into the corners of the old, overstuffed horsehide sofa. He dialed up the wall sconces to a dim, homey lighting, solicitous of Frederick's sensitive eyes. He took an Apollo 8 Jim Beam decanter full of stunning Irish whiskey off the sideboard and poured himself a finger of it, not offering any to his brothers. Now, how did it happen? He wanted to speak to Dad, Frederick said. He climbed out of me and wandered down through the tunnels into the spring pool. The goblin told us that he took off his clothes and waded in and started whispering. Like most of the boys, George had believed that their father was most aware in his very middle, where he could direct the echoes of the water's rippling, shape them into words and phrases in the hollow of the great cavern. So the goblin saw it happen? No, Frederick said, and Edward began to cry again. No, George asked him for some privacy, and so he went a little way up the tunnel. He waited and waited, but George didn't come back. He called out, but George didn't answer. And when he went to look for him, he was gone. His clothes were gone. All that he could find was this. He scrabbled to fit his chubby hand in his jacket's pocket, then fished out a little black pebble. Alan took it and saw that it wasn't a pebble. It was a rotted out and dried up fingertip, pierced with an unbent paperclip. It's Dave's, isn't it? Edward said. I think so, Alan said. Dave used to spend hours wiring his dropped-off parts back onto his body, gluing his teeth back into his head. Jesus. We're going to die, aren't we? Frederick said. We're going to starve to death. Edward held his pudgy hands one on top of the other in his lap and began to rock back and forth. We'll be okay, he lied. Did anyone see Dave? Alan asked. No, Frederick said. We asked the golems. We asked Dad. We asked the goblin. But no one saw him. No one's seen him for years. Alan thought for a moment about how to ask his next question. Did you look in the pool? On the bottom? He's not there, Edward said. We looked there. We looked all around, Dad. We looked in town. Alan, they're both gone. Alan felt a sear of acid jet up his esophagus. I don't know what to do, he said. I don't know where to look, Frederick. Can't you, I don't know, stuff yourself with something so you can eat? We tried, Edward said. We tried rags and sawdust and clay and bread, and they didn't work. I thought that maybe we could get a child and put him inside. Maybe, but God, Albert, I don't want to do that. It's the kind of thing Dan would do. Alan stared at the softly glowing wood floors, reflecting highlights from the soft lighting. He rubbed his stocking toes over the waxy finish and felt it shine. Don't do that, okay? He said. I'll think of something. Let me sleep on it. Do you want to sleep here? I can make up the sofa. Thanks, big brother, Edward said. Thanks. All right, then. I'll talk to you next week when I'm back from Disneyland Paris.